What is art?
Art is...
Art is history.
What is art? That's a good question.
This is Art Uncovered.
Art is our collective cultural history.
A weekly podcast that brings you interviews with an eclectic mix of artists and creators.
Art is...
disappointing your parents.
I'm your host, Kimberly.
I always think that, at least from my point of view, doing a series of photographs is about answering a question. You know, like if you have a question, you have a premise, you may have like some ideas, but you're not really sure until you explore it. And then eventually you either answered the question, or you're still curious.
Thanks for tuning in, listeners. The voice you just heard was that of my guest, Muriel Hasbun, a Washington, D.C. based artist whose work explores issues of cultural identity, migration, and memory. Over the course of the episode, we talk about El Salvador's 12-year civil war, the significance of Muriel's mother's art gallery during wartime, and her interest in photography's ability to capture subjective experiences. Stay with us. Welcome back, listeners. Thanks again for tuning in to this week's episode of Art Uncovered. This week, I am so honored to be here with Muriel Hasbun. Muriel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. It's so great to connect with you. So I'm wildly interested in learning about your current show, which is up at the Salisbury University, and the title of the show is called With a Pulse of Community. And in a statement that was published by the gallery space, it says that your work was largely based on archives and memories of El Salvador during the Civil War. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, maybe just to give some context for that time period, if you could tell us a little bit about what was going on in El Salvador at that time.
Sure. So the Civil War in El Salvador took place between 1980 and 1992. It was basically the government and its military and what became the FMLN, or the guerrilla movement that became, an internal army. It was very violent. 75,000 people died, 8,000 disappeared, and many, many, many people left El Salvador, which is basically the bulk of the migration to the States from El Salvador and, eventually Central America as well. But it was a very disruptive time, to say the least. Mm-hmm. And I graduated from high school in 1979. So right before the war erupted. And I left El Salvador because of the war. And I was lucky that my parents were able to get me out of the country, basically, and have me study outside of El Salvador, because the universities were, like the main university was closed. If you could avoid being there, it was a good, especially if you were young, especially male, because they would both sides would recruit boys. They would just pick them up from the street. Mm-hmm. So my parents were really scared, and they got my brother out too, like a year later, after I had been out of the country for like a year. And then he finished high school here.
Okay.
And he lived with a family, and people that we found that were really amazing people.
Wow. So I have a couple of follow-up questions there. I read in, I believe it was published by The Curator? You sent me a beautiful write-up that I believe is going to be part of the catalog of the show.
Right. So the curator of the show is Jamie McClellan. Okay. But Andy Grunberg wrote an essay for it.
Yes. And in that essay, I was really moved by the role of your mother. So my understanding is that, did your mother create like an art space for people to to express themselves in regards to either art or specifically the war in El Salvador?
Well, it was, so my mom in 1977 started a gallery. She started an art gallery. She first,
and this was in El Salvador.
In El Salvador, okay. Yeah.
Wow.
And so she started it at our house. And
how cool.
Yeah. And then, it was like sort of by appointment, but it was like a room that she kind of set up like that. And then eventually, she moved the gallery outside of the house a few years later. But I guess, she had always loved art, and many of her friends were artists and poets and, intellectuals. And so, there was a lot of activity in our house with like cultural stuff. And that became kind of really my education, like my first art education.
Very cool.
And also my dad was an amateur photographer. So, that was kind of part of the entourage of what I grew up with. So she started that gallery, and Galeria Laberinto, it was called, or the Labyrinth. And it became like the place for the arts in San Salvador during that time, during the Civil War years. And so that's the contradiction that, at the same time that there was this horrendous violence and killings and disappearances, et cetera, there was also this incredible activity during the same time period. And a lot of my work deals with preserving a lot of these stories that we don't really know very much. Like people don't usually think El Salvador and art together.
Yeah,
Right. So, and it also kind of counters this whole idea that, people that come from other places, or Central America especially, are not creative people. And so from my point of view, it's like a really important, it has become a very important way of trying to say something about the place that I come from, that is a little bit different from what you hear, which is basically, violence and criminality and, like all kinds of narratives that stick, and that people usually don't look beyond just kind of the surface.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe we could talk about some of those alternative narratives that you are creating in your work. So the show, my understanding is that it is made up of a number of different series or bodies of work. Is that true?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Do you have one that you would like to, one or more pieces that you would like to talk about, maybe that exemplify this alternative narrative?
Sure. So I guess the more specific one is in relation to my mother's gallery is Pulse. It's called Pulse New Cultural Narratives. And it is a body of work that I did during the pandemic and after, where I had just photographed I went to El Salvador to photograph the seismic registers at the National Archives in El Salvador. And what I was trying to do is map this idea of a cultural territory, or the cultural land of El Salvador. And so using the movements of the earth as this metaphor for the idea of what I call terruño in Spanish, which is basically homeland, but it really refers to the land. And so it's using really three archives. It's using the archives from the National Archives that are the seismograms, and then also my mother's gallery's archive, which I recovered, and then my own photographs sometimes. Like in this case, for example, this is a self-portrait in some ways. It's my back as I photographed it as a self-portrait back in the 80s. And then it also has the seismogram, which you see the lines and the numbers going up my spine, basically, kind of creating my spine. And then that detail of a painting by one of the artists from El Salvador, Carlos Cañas.
Oh, interesting. What
So
would
it's
you call
kind
it?
of a
A seismograph? Can you explain what this is?
Sure. So a seismogram is a recording of the Earth's movements.
Oh,
And so they are these documents that, are preserved by many different institutions, right? But in El Salvador, they're in the National Archives.
okay.
And they record the movements of the earth. And El Salvador is a very volcanic land. It has over 14 volcanoes in a territory of the size of Massachusetts. And earthquakes have been part of its history, but it also reflects on our movement on it as well. And so I think about yeah, we're walking on it, we're affecting it as well, obviously. But, the cultural output of our people is also part of that movement.
Oh,
And so that's kind of the idea of like, we all have our testimonies as people. And so this gallery had an incredible cultural and artistic activity during a time of war.
oh.
And there's a way of somehow preserving, like it's in the land, hopefully. And at the same time, you have my own presence there, like through my photographs that I made during that same time period. And so it all collects, like the images that are collected here are images from the earth, from the artists, including me, and the gallery that brought them all together as well.
Were you making at that time, because you said, and listeners, if you're listening to this on Spotify or any platform that does not have video, we're also streaming this on YouTube, so you could take a look at some of our visual references here. But you mentioned that in this particular one, which you called kind of it's actually titled Self-Portrait, that there's an image of your back. Now, I'm curious, when you were making work at that time, were you intentionally making work about the war?
Not really. Not at, although I take that back because I was trying to figure out whether I should become a photographer then. I had already gone to college. I had studied literature and psychology. And then, I had always loved photography, but I never considered it as what I wanted to do, supposedly, when I grew up. And when I went back to El Salvador after college, I realized that all I was doing was photographing, and I was going to refugee camps and going out on the street and photographing. And so in some ways I was photographing the war, but I didn't, and then I was also making portraits of the artists who work with my mom. So I have like these records of that time period. I didn't know at the time what I was going to do with, but then it became part of Pulse.
Do you consider yourself a photographer now?
Yeah, yeah, I do.
And I would love to talk about your style of photographs, because as I was doing some screen shares here, your work is often very abstract, right? Like you mentioned that you did a lot of documentary style or street style photographs, but from what I'm seeing on the screen here anyway, it seems like you're interested in the abstract nature of photography. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that style choice and maybe how that works in with some of the ideas you're touching upon.
Sure. So I guess I always felt, especially when I came to the US, and I think the fact of leaving home was very influential, and at first it was like through poetry and writing, and then, I always had my camera, never really considered it, what I wanted to do, but it was from the beginning, I had this sense that I wanted to allude to things that sometimes you couldn't see. And, which is a contradictory, like a paradox, with photography, because photography records what you see. And so, so how do you do that? And so I had studied literature, and I was very interested in the idea of metaphor and the idea of synesthesia, and how do you allude to different senses, even if the first one is the visual. And that's actually my MFA thesis was about that, specifically about how do you incorporate how I had been influenced by poets in bringing together words to create metaphor, and how could you do that with photography. And so the idea of photographing what you can't see, what's invisible, is what I was trying to do, and what I've been trying to do all my life. Like in some ways, alluding to emotions, alluding to other feelings, alluding to other sensations that are not only the visual, or that through the visual you might be able to get, like a sense of touch and a sense of smell. And so Marcel Proust, the French writer, I loved, and the surrealist poets as well. Yeah, so it's been like a way of trying to say what I want to express about the reality that we're seeing, so that it's not only a descriptive kind of record, but also an elusive, metaphorical record that, says something about our subjectivity, about who we are, about how we feel, how we react, etc. And so, yeah, it's just been like I love the fact that photography is also a record and a document of something that basically was there, right? And then it's not no longer there. That's like the whole thing about photography. It's like it's there and it's not there. So, but at the same time, I think that we can somehow pierce through these other realities that we sometimes discard, that we don't like think that photography can apprehend in some way. So I'm interested in that. Yeah.
I'm curious, because you taught for many years in higher education. Were you teaching in a photography department?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I would love to know how some of your like the techniques or skills that you use in your own practice, how that manifested into the classroom. Like, did you encourage your students to be experimental with their media? Did you encourage them to work with communities?
All of the above.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a balance, how to, in teaching, on the one hand, there can be very specific classes that are about something like, experimental photography, which would be a way to just kind of go deep into ways of being very creative in the ways that you use the medium. But I'm also interested in using different mediums in some ways, to communicate things, just because sometimes one thing doesn't do it, and so I guess I've always, in teaching, I have always emphasized that the form really needs to follow the content. Like you have to figure out how it is that you can marry these two things, right? And it's always a process of researching not just the thing that you're trying to explore, but also within yourself, like how it is that you're reacting and responding to what you're seeing or trying to explain. And I always think that, at least from my point of view, doing a series of photographs is about answering a question. Like if you have a question, you have a premise, you may have like some ideas, but you're not really sure until you explore it. And then that's kind of a way of answering your question. And so then the process of doing that will give you some answers, which is only through the practice of photography or whatever it is, the practice of art, that you can reach there. And, like you keep doing it, and then eventually you either answered the question, or, and you keep just plugging away because you're still curious, or there's still like something that is not quite resolved. So, I mean, I think that I always try to encourage students to follow their intuition and to follow their voice, to like not try to be like somebody else, but rather like try to find what is unique about them in this particular moment in time in response to this particular issue, whatever that may be. But yeah, to just kind of experiment and try different things, because there's not always one answer.
Yeah, yeah. I wish I had you as a teacher. When did you retired, right?
Yeah.
You retired, yeah. I guess my final question for you, Muriel, is I'd love to learn about, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but Labyrintho projects.
Labyrintho, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you tell us about this? This is an investigation that you started when?
So it kind of evolved out of my teaching, actually.
Okay.
So Labyrintho Projects is based on my mother's gallery's archive. So that's why it's called Labyrintho, because the name of the gallery was
Labyrinth. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, so it's the Labyrinth. So in 2006, I had a Fulbright scholar grant when I went, and basically it was to go to El Salvador. And it was the first time that I went to El Salvador as an adult, as an artist, like doing an exhibition and teaching workshops and bringing community together, which is basically like a little model of what I wanted to do with my work in all of its forms. And so it was like making photographs, having exhibitions, but also engaging with community. And I wanted to get to know El Salvador in a different way, basically as an adult, because I had left so young,
Yeah.
and even though I had gone back and forth a lot, this was a time to explore a little bit more about its history. But when I came back, I found that I really wanted to create some sort of link between there and here, especially one, through my teaching, two, through some sort of vehicle for artists to communicate. And yeah, just basically just finding, finding a way of connecting and for me to learn more about the history and everything. So I decided to teach a class on El Salvador, its art and culture. That's how it started. And I began to bring speakers into the class, people who were based in the US. And then I would always have some sort of component that was an outreach component with my students. And it evolved into this sort of laboratory, about El Salvador and its artists.
Wow.
And the way that it started is also that it continued was because so my mom passed away in 2012, and after that, the next year I decided that I would teach the class as this kind of laboratory about Laberinto, about what the gallery was. And so there were students who were photography students and also masters, new media and photojournalism students, and some exhibition design students. Like there were like, like a very interdisciplinary group of students who would help create this growing archive, part of it was to preserve it. And then the other was to create more things that would be part of this archive that would inform it, So we went to El Salvador to photograph, to actually video interview a series of artists who had worked with my mom so that we could learn about the time period. And, that was kind of the basis for it. And then it evolved from there, then in 2016. So I don't know if you know the story of the Corcoran, but the Corcoran was taken over by George Washington University, and its art collection was taken over by the National Gallery of Art. And in that whole process, 2 years after 2014 and 2016, many of us lost our job as part of this whole, change that was huge. And so as my reinvention moment, I was like, okay, well, I've been doing this all these years, teaching it. And then, we had just finished doing these amazing exhibitions that one of them was called Legacy and Memory, Tracing the Labyrinth. The other one in the year after was Vivencias, which was a series of exhibitions that my mother had in the gallery that were the first instances of installation and performance in El Salvador in a gallery. And so we created this exhibition that was like a dialogue between young artists and the older artists. And so, there were all these things already that were like amazing records and activities to kind of memorialize this time period, but at the same time, invigorate it with the present artists and the present vision. So it all, it kind of became like a natural thing. Well, I should start a nonprofit to try to promote this work. Yeah. And so then I ended up doing workshops for K through 12 and museum educators if they wanted to learn about the art and culture of El Salvador. And I ended up taking them there and having them meet all these artists and learn about, the art and the country and the history and et cetera, which is basically what I had done with my students.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so now it's this platform that exists. I mean, you can see it on my website, but it also has its own website that's called Laberinto Projects.
That's so exciting. Are you still doing like workshops and exhibitions?
I haven't done them since the pandemic,
Okay.
but I do like small workshops, like sometimes people invite me to do like some sort of workshop. And then, of course, as part of my own work, I also have interactive installations that are part of it. And so, for example, there's one that's in the show in Salisbury, which is called Arte Voz, basically art voice, where it's this sculptural piece that there's two sculptures that I made with an artist from El Salvador. And Baltasar Portillo is his name. And these two exist. They're in the two different countries in the US and in El Salvador. And through that, there's like a little workshop that I do with people that come to it, and they respond to the different artworks from the collection that my mom had in the gallery, or some of the artwork that was, shown at the gallery.
So I chose La Camba by Armando Campos. And I chose this piece because it made me think of all the people who could have been artists if they had the chance.
Hey everybody, so I picked Antonio Bonilla, Bajo los Templos de la Sombra de la Justicia. So I picked this one because the artist is obviously talking about sombra, which is part of the lecture, right? Thinking about how shadows are places where a lot of things happen and a lot of things are forgotten or masked.
And they eventually tell a story or a memory that's basically comes out of this artwork.
Growing up like first generation, like Guatemalan American, when I look back at pictures of what home looks like, or my family's home, it's always like these colors, and I think these colors are really like prominent when it comes to Central American art.
Then at the same time, you're able to transmit your heartbeat to the other country and hear it in the other country.
Oh my
And
God.
so it's kind of like this, bodily response to art.
Okay, so this show that is up at Salisbury University, again, the title of which is called With a Pulse of Community, that is up until October
26th.
October 26th. All right, listeners. And where is that? What city is this in, or town?
Salisbury, Maryland.
Maryland. All right,
Yeah.
listeners, if any of you are based in Maryland, please stop by. We'll promote lots of images from the show, and I encourage you to follow Muriel's social media and whatnot. We'll include all the links on our website, artuncoveredpodcast.com. Muriel, thank you so much for joining us. It was absolutely an honor, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. It was great. It was really fun.
All right, listeners, that's all for this week. Please be sure to tune in 2 weeks to hear our interview with Ash Hagerstrand, a Brooklyn-based artist whose sculptural and digital work addresses technology and issues within the medical field as it relates to people with disabilities. Hope to see y'all then. Have a safe week. Bye-bye.